This podcast is the design of City Sites Urban Media, and our goal is to bring into focus the difference between culture and God's ideas found in His Word. To learn more, go to citysitesurbanmedia.com.
Whatever you do, someone somewhere will be offended by it.
I believe one of the greatest human failings is to prefer to be right than to be effective. And political correctness is always obsessed with how right it is without thinking of how effective it might be.
The Washington Post newspaper is, if it will pardon the expression, on the warpath against the name of the Washington Redskins football team. The paper says the name is racist, insulting, demeaning, insensitive, and so on. But the Washington Post takes its name from its city, which is named for George Washington, who was not only a slave owner, he was a tobacco farmer, which some progressives probably think is almost as awful.
No way!
Surely the Post should change its name and should demand that the nation's capital be renamed.
There are stupid kids. One of the terms now used to describe these stupid kids is minimally exceptional. Can you handle that? Minimally exceptional. Whatever happened to the old reliable explanation? The boy is slow. Some of the other children are quick. They think quickly. Not this boy. He's slow. But no, he's minimally exceptional. Political correctness cripples discourse, creates ugly language, and is generally stupid.
This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
Today on the City Sites Podcast, we're going to talk about politically correct topic. In fact, the topic is being politically correct. And I know many times we hear that term, but what does it really mean? And with me today is the Executive Director of Operation High Ground, Rick Norling. And Rick is with me to kind of process this. I think the politically correct crowd in the beginning probably had a point. Let's look at how we are using language and how we commemorate certain types of people in our past that may not have been really very reputable. But I think it's gotten to the point now where everything is being questioned and everyone has an offense to take. And all of a sudden, the freedom of speech is no longer really free. It comes with a price, because if you use a politically incorrect term, you could be ostracized or sanctioned in some way by these folks. And it becomes a little bit more problematic, I think, for the church as we become more and more inundated by language that wants us to change how we use terms to describe God. So, Rick, what do you think about that?
Everything is going at warp speed. Things that have happened, I think 20 years ago, 80% or 70% of the people that are making a living on jobs that didn't exist 20 years ago. And I mean, so that gives you an example of just how fast everything is moving. And certainly when this is happening, this is man's way of trying to make everything an even playing ground for people and forgetting completely about how God looks at things.
Well, I have heard a commentator once say that political correctness is like brainwashing. Just to define brainwashing, it's also known as mind control, coercive persuasion, thought control, thought reform, or re-education. It is the concept that the human mind can be altered or controlled by certain psychological techniques. And that's what this commentator was saying, that political correctness is rewiring the way we use words and what we associate with those words. And as you just mentioned, things are moving so fast from yesteryear to today, and yet it almost seems that people who have bought into political correctness almost, and I'm not saying that anyone has said this, but it seems to me as if they're saying anything from the past is bad. You know, it's like the changing of names of lakes in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that was named after a leader in the Senate or the government, and now it was discovered he had slaves, so therefore he's not qualified to have that name attached to the lake, so they named it something else. I mean, that is kind of revisionism in a way, going back in history and saying, well, nothing back there was really good enough because it was always racist or whatever, biased in some way. So I think the commentator has a point. It's a little like brainwashing in today's culture. I'd like to play a sound clip from London Real, where David Icke is the person making commentary here. The fascinating part of what he is saying is that it's all part of a plan. Take a listen.
I have this phrase that I use, know the outcome and you'll see the journey. What I mean by that is if you don't know the outcome, where the world is being taken and why, but certainly where, then daily events appear to be random. This event happens, that event happens, that event happens, and there appears to be no pattern to them because, well, they're just random events, they just happen. But when you know what the outcome is designed to be, the random events now take on a very different interpretation. Because now you see that these apparently random events are stepping stones to that outcome. So what is the outcome in terms of political correctness and censorship? The plan is that eventually no one will see or hear anything that the authorities don't want you to see and hear. That's the outcome they're going towards. And so the censorship is squeezing and squeezing and squeezing free thought, free opinion, free speech. You're seeing it all the time. And one of the most important things, and this was all planned, I'll talk about all this forever as well, was to move where people get their information from away from newspapers and traditional media onto the internet. And now people get the vast majority of their information from the internet. The key reason for that is once it's on the internet, algorithms can start dictating what you see and hear. You know, they can't in a newspaper. You know, there's censorship in newspapers, of course, but at least it's there to be seen and debated. You know, why is this not in the paper? But what we're getting now is algorithms that are censoring what can be seen and heard, even once the codes are in, without human input. So all this is moving towards that point they're aiming for, where you don't see anything or hear anything that the authorities have not basically approved. And this is where political correctness and the destruction of free speech comes in. It's all part of the same thing. Political correctness is the population being manipulated to silence itself. So the more and more people they can be persuade and encourage to be upset and offended and have a sense of victimhood, the more excuses they have to say, no, we're stopping that because it's offending people. That's offensive. Because they have more and more excuses to censor because you mustn't offend anybody.
Well, it sounds like to me that the revisionists that are using political correctness have an agenda to control and or alter how we get our information.
You use the word revisionist, and it truly is a revisioning of what's happening. And certainly we have to learn what we've come from, or where we're going will make no sense. But the best thing to do when you're dealing with political correctness is not necessarily agree with what somebody is saying, in my opinion. I just recently, I Google searched and I did political correctness, which I encourage the listeners to do. But one of the statements that is said in the Wikipedia thing, and now it's way too much to read, I've got 7 or 8 pages of it, but one of the statements that said, commentators on the political left in the United States contend that conservatives use the concept of political correctness to downplay and divert attention from substantively discriminatory behavior against disadvantaged groups. They also argue that the political right enforces its own forms of political correctness to suppress criticism of its favored constituencies and ideologies. In the United States, the term has played a major role in the culture war between conservatives and liberals. Well, according to the Wikipedia, this ideology, where it actually goes back into Marxism, and it was actually originally founded in Germany when socialism and communism were fighting amongst each other. It's got some very interesting roots, and I think before people accept it as the norm, they need to take the time to research it themselves to find out what it is and what it isn't, rather than just take somebody's word for it.
We always think, well, if it's on the internet, it must be right, but we really don't know the full ramifications. You know what I found, Rick, was very interesting is I have a list of 100 politically correct words and phrases, and I'm not going to read the full 100 list, but I found several of them quite interesting. For example, the word homeless. That's not proper anymore. Politically correct language would be outdoor urban dwellers. Isn't that good? Here's another one. The word stupid. Now, we know the word stupid isn't very nice, right? But the new politically correct word is intellectually impaired. Well, how about immigrant? Immigrant is no longer should be used, but the politically correct word is newcomer. So that's the kind of thing that I think drives people nuts. They're just trying to find every way to soften language. But it is giving, I think, freedom of speech a black eye, because you can't be free to speak the way you want, because it has to be in a certain genre. It has to be in a certain way that everybody will never be offended by what you say. And it goes back to our audio clip we played a few minutes ago, that this is all heading in a direction that is controlled and managed, and therefore giving us only what the people that are in control of managing this correct or incorrect speech is allowing us to hear.
Well, and you mentioned, what was the word, newcomer?
Yeah, immigrant is now, should be called newcomer, not immigrant.
Effectively, to be politically correct, we could call them illegal newcomers. But in looking at that, the wording is such, and I mean, it all ties into what you said. It breaks down your freedom, because now all of a sudden we're being told we've lost the ability to think, which brings us back to the original question, is how do we relate to God in these things with the word changing so fast and everything happening? We even go back to the fact of the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech. Now, that pretty much is put into neutral under political correctness, because somebody's going to be offended. Somebody is going to be offended by anything that anybody does at any given time of the day if you really find a way to break it down. You know, there's so many different ways that we can look at things. Now, I also printed out certain facts about the First Amendment. Well, you know, one of the reasons that the First Amendment is so important is that the First Amendment is probably because it grants people freedom of speech. It prohibits prior restraint and declares the right to peaceably assemble. Well, that's not going to happen if you're tied into the political correct standpoint. So it's a way of undermining the Constitution, which so many people that I've become aware of with Operation High Ground, of dealing with and serving the country, to protect the country and to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is really a part of it, and it really falls back into it. The important part of protecting the Constitution is that the Constitution protects all our rights to stand together as a group, to stand together to worship the way we want to worship. And so nobody can take that away from us, which political correctness tends to undermine.
Then, Rick, I think you would agree with Ben Shapiro.
Freedom of speech. Those of us here in the United States gave up our First Amendment rights a long time ago. We gave them up in the name of political correctness and in the name of being non-offensive. The First Amendment is dead. Long live the reign of sensitivity. We should be able to say what we want without fear of government reprisal.
When I was a pastor, Rick, a number of years ago, I remember one week I was using the word mankind. It was in Genesis, okay? And I was told the very next day or the following week that I shouldn't use that term because that's offensive to women. So I was told I should use humankind. However, the name man in the Hebrew, in the original language, really means male and female. So mankind is not male or female, it's both. So I think that sometimes political correctness, as it becomes more prevalent, not only in culture, but it becomes prevalent in the church. So sooner or later, we're going to have to, or be forced to, or whether it's considered hate speech or whatever, we're going to be asked to change our language, which will dummy down the meaning of the words, like sin, like immorality, like homosexuality, like those kinds of words that really define something that is an abomination to him. The other thing that I think is very interesting, by the way, Rick, is that a lot of the politically correct people who are very conscientious about not wanting to offend anybody with words will be the first people to use the F word. Have you ever noticed that?
Yes.
The F word is just prevalent everywhere amongst millennials and amongst college people on the screen. And I ask myself, these people are very liberal. Most of them are very liberal. And they wouldn't dare use words that would be offensive to somebody. And yet that word they use, and that is the most vulgar. It is a word that is humiliating and it's insulting, yet it's used every day for all kinds of situations. That seems to be hypocritical to me. Well, I want to just go back to the church. I foresee the future bringing certain changes. For example, sin will not be used because if you call somebody a sinner, that's offensive. So you can't talk about, we're all sinners and saved by grace. That's offensive.
But who is that offensive to?
Well, it's offensive to those who are politically correct because they think somebody is going to be maligned some way if you call them a sinner. But that's what the Bible says.
But if somebody on, let's say, using your phrase, the politically left, is offended by that, how about the people that quoted from the politically right? So somebody on that side is offended when somebody speaks up against it.
Yeah, everyone's offended by something, right, at some point in time. Going on, the words that surround the idea of morality will no longer be used because there's no longer a set of values anyone thinks is moral, so it's irrelevant. So anything moral is totally thrown out the window. The other thing, judgment, will no longer be politically correct because the word means punishment, and God is not into punishment anymore. Again, it creates an uncomfortable anxiety. So you can't use it. Hell will be also incorrect to use because there is no hell, so why talk about it? Hell creates anxiety and anticipates a punishment. Therefore, it's politically incorrect to use. How about salvation? Will be politically correct to talk about, but it will mean that as a human, you are saved by virtue of your humanity. And that's the only way salvation will define. In other words, as a human, you're saved because you're human. Has nothing to do with God, has nothing to do with Christianity, the cross, and so forth. That's where we're moving. Religion is politically correct if it accepts everyone just the way they are and there are no rules to follow. That means that there is no right or wrong. It's all neutral. Again, that's the direction political correctness is going when it takes a left turn, when it looks at words that we, the church, have used for centuries to define the condition of man and the salvation and the grace and mercy of God. One last one. Genders are neutral. Morals are neutral. Religion is neutral. Humans are neutral. No rich, no poor. All of life is on the same playing field with no exceptions or exclusions. That's the direction. Like communism or like socialism, everyone's equal. There's no difference. Everyone's the same. One size fits all. Well, I'm not sure, Rick, if that's the kind of world any of us really want to live in, but that's the kind of world that's being created by much of this political correctness.
When you put a car in neutral, it doesn't go anywhere. It just sits there and revs up its engine, makes a lot of noise, and it really loses its functionability. And it no longer is able to do what it was designed to do if it never leaves neutral. Same with our speech and same with what we're trying to accomplish with political correctness. If we go into neutral where everybody is the same, that doesn't work. You'd mentioned all these different things about identifying with different things, and a friend of mine sent me a little saying on email the other day. It said, shouldn't a 16-year-old who identifies as a 21-year-old be allowed to consume alcohol? Shouldn't a 40-year-old who identifies as a 70-year-old receive Social Security benefits and the senior citizen discount at the movie theater? If we're going to identify people simply because of their feelings, doesn't anything go?
Well, that's a good point, and that's, again, another one of those characteristics of society where we're headed. I can identify as a female or as a male or whatever, and it's kind of like the world turned upside down, and everything is just spilled out, and nothing is really assembled anymore. It's just all parts on the floor, and it reminds me of the prophet Isaiah, because he said back in chapter 5, verse 20, that there will come a day that when people will call good evil and evil good, and that's kind of where we are. It's a ploy of the evil one to create confusion. And I think political correctness is that. It's to create confusion about how people think about words. And words are important because as humans, we use words to communicate. And so if I can confuse you through communication somehow and give you different set of values that are attached to words that aren't necessarily values attached to God, but values attached to human thinking or humanism, that's the direction we're going. I think that's the danger for the church today.
One of my favorite things to do in the past is to have nice, I can use the word debate, but I'd rather use the word discussion with someone who I don't understand or I don't agree with, because I can only begin to tell you the amount that I've learned through those conversations. We may walk away agreeing, we may not walk away probably even farther apart in our views than others, but I've at least learned where they're coming from. And I'm able to discuss those things and to be able to not judge the person because of their beliefs, but rather to be able to walk with them and accept what they're saying. Again, whether I agree with it or not. One of the things, Larry, I think that we need to look at is we really need to get past the point of accepting what somebody says as a fact and go back to digging for ourselves. I've never met a pastor in a church yet that doesn't tell you to look in the Bible, but even so he says that, I'm sure many of the people that sit in the pews also take what the pastor has said as face value and not take the time to dig themselves. I think if people would really start to be interested in what they're dealing with and dig a little bit themselves.
Well, one of the things, Rick, you remind me of this, that the Holy Spirit's job is to bring conviction on the earth of sin. And really, political correctness is really trying to undermine that. Anything that brings conviction, anything that brings maybe a change of heart, change of mind, that's the kind of thing that political correctness wants to change. And so if the Holy Spirit is bringing conviction about sin, about immorality, about all of those things, he has to wade through all of the different words now that represent something other than just conviction, sin, or immorality. I think there's a spiritual element here at the base of it all that is probably anti-God and anti-church and anti-Jesus.
I agree that it is an anti-God movement, and we're very close to the point of no return, that if we allow this to go too much further, it's going to be hard to step back into what was there without at least being able to fight for it. And we have to be aware at this point, we have to wake up and be able to realize that we are one of the last voices in the world to be able to freely express what we have. We have to hold on to that with both arms.
We need to stop allowing political correctness to dictate our policies, because it's going to kill us if we don't. But I believe in the Teddy Roosevelt philosophy. Teddy Roosevelt said, we are a nation of immigrants. As such, everybody is welcome from any race, any country, any religion, if they want to be Americans, if they want to accept our values and our laws. If not, they should stay where they are.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday, we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are a part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.
This is the City Sites Podcast Network.